So I did my video on the National Security Council. So the National Security Council was an attempt at reflecting each president's personal management style, and it has changed many times in terms of who has been president and what they needed. So the NSC depended on the interpersonal chemistry between the president and his principal advisors and department heads. But despite the relationships between individuals, a satisfactory organizational structure had to be developed, for without it, necessary flow of information and implementation of decisions could not occur. So President Truman, while NSC was dominated by the Department of State, President Eisenhower's preference for the military staff system, however, led to development of the NSC along those lines. The NSC staff coordinated an elaborate structure for monitoring the implementation of policies, and that organization's executive secretary became an assistant to the president, but was sufficiently discreet not to conflict with a powerful Secretary of State, which was John Foster Dulles. So President Kennedy may have initially looked to a strong Secretary of State to take charge of foreign policy making, but turned to other strategies when it became apparent that the Department of State did not have sufficient authority over other departments. So Kennedy, who preferred policy making with ad hoc groups, dismantled Eisenhower's elaborate NSC machinery and allowed the Special Assistant for National Security Affairs and his staff to assume primary coordination roles. So Kennedy's freewheeling style tended to erase the distinction between policymaking and operations that President Eisenhower's regiment and staff system so carefully observed. So sharing Kennedy's affinity for informal advisory arrangements, President Johnson led the NSC structure atrophy still further, and like his predecessor, relied instead on the National Security Advisor and his staff in various ad hoc groups and trusted friends. But he also consulted regularly with his Tuesday lunch group, and in 1966 officially turned over responsibility for the supervision and coordination of interdepartmental activities overseas to the Secretary of State, and they had mixed results. So under President Nixon and Ford, Henry Kissinger's expanded NSC staff concentrated on acquiring analytical information from the various departments that would allow the National Security Advisor to put before the president the best possible range of options for decision. So the system was in perfect accord with President Nixon's preference for detailed written expositions rather than interpersonal groupings, and Kissinger concentrated on a handful of major issues and allowed some foreign matters to evolve by default to the President of State, while weapons and international financial questions were dealt with by the Department of Defense and the Treasury. So Kissinger at first attempted to restore the separation between policymaking and implementation, but eventually found himself personally performing both roles. And then under President Carter's, the National Security Advisor became a principal source of foreign affairs ideas, and the NSC staff was recruited and managed with that in view. While a collegial approach to government decision-making was emphasized under President Reagan, in the Reagan administration, the National Security Advisor was downgraded, and the Chief of Staff to the President exercised a coordinating role in the White House. The collegiality among powerful department heads was not successfully maintained, and conflicts became public. The NSC staff tended to merge as a separate contending party. So under President Bush's eyes, reorganized the NSC organization to include a principals committee, deputies committee, and 8 policy coordinating committees. The NSC, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the unification of Germany, and the deployment of American troops in Iraq and Panama, the Clinton administration continued to emphasize the collegial approach within the NSC on national security matters. The NSC membership was expanded to include the Secretary of Treasury, the U.S. Representative to the United Nations, and the newly created Assistant to the President for Economic Policy, the President's Chief of Staff, and the President's National Security Advisor. And the act also established the CIA, which grew out of the World War II era Office of Strategic Services and small post-war intelligence organizations. So the CIA served as a primary civilian intelligence gathering organization in the government. Later, the Defense Intelligence Agency became the main military intelligence body. Then in 1947, law also caused far-reaching changes in the military establishment. And then the War Department and Navy Department merged into a single Department of Defense under the Secretary of Defense, who also directed the newly created Department of the Air Force. However, each of these three branches maintained their own secretaries. And in 1949, the act was amended to give the Secretary of Defense more power over the individual services and their secretaries.